Richard Wallace had everything most men would envy. At 42, he stood among New York's financial elite, a man whose name carried weight on Wall Street. His penthouse apartment stretched high above the city skyline, with floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed glittering towers at night and a wash of golden sunlight every morning. To outsiders, Richard was the definition of success. Sharp suits, luxury cars, business deals closed with a confident handshake. But inside the polished glass walls of his home, silence ruled, and the silence was unbearable. The silence belonged to Ethan. At 5 years old, the boy's presence was quiet but heavy, like an unanswered question hanging in every room. He had dark brown eyes that avoided contact, and a mouth that rarely formed words. Ethan wasn't mute. He could speak when he wanted, but most of the time he simply refused. And worst of all, he had never called Richard Daddy. The absence of that single word cut deeper than Richard ever admitted. From the day Ethan was born, life had unraveled in ways Richard hadn't prepared for. His wife, Emily, the love of his youth, had died during childbirth. The memory of that night haunted him. Sterile hospital lights, a doctor's grim face, the sound of a newborn's cry that should have been joyful, but only reminded him of what he had lost. He had walked out of that hospital with a baby in his arms and a hollow chest that no amount of wealth could fill. Richard tried to be a father in the only way he knew how, by providing. He built a nursery filled with the finest toys money could buy, hired tutors, therapists, and caretakers, ensuring Ethan never lacked comfort. Yet none of it bridged the gap between them. When Richard entered a room, Ethan shrank into himself, retreating behind silence. When Richard tried to read him a book, Ethan turned away. Every attempt at connection ended in quiet rejection. In 3 months alone, 18 nannies had passed through the Wallace residence. Each arrived with impressive credentials, some with advanced degrees in child psychology, others with glowing references from wealthy families. But within days, sometimes hours, they quit. Ethan wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't speak, wouldn't even meet their eyes. Some called him stubborn. Others whispered about trauma they couldn't handle. Richard paid their salaries without argument, but every failure added weight to his frustration. He told himself he was too busy to dwell on it. The empire he had built demanded his attention. His calendar was packed with board meetings, investor calls, and networking dinners. But in the quiet of the night, after the meetings and the handshakes, he would step into Ethan's room and watch the boy sleep. There, Richard felt the sharpest ache. He wanted desperately to be seen, not as a provider, not as a stranger in an expensive suit, but as a father. "Why won't you let me in?" he whispered once, standing by Ethan's bedside. His son stirred slightly, turned onto his side, but no answer came. The silence pressed back against him, heavy and final. It wasn't just about Ethan. Richard carried his own scars, ones he seldom admitted even to himself. Raised by a father who measured love in achievements, Richard had grown up in a home where affection was scarce and expectations endless. Now history seemed to repeat itself, despite his desperate wish to break the cycle. And yet deep within that silence a hope remained. He believed there had to be a way to reach his son, some hidden path that 18 nannies, countless specialists, and his own fumbling efforts had all failed to find. Before the story unfolds further, if you want to follow journeys of transformation, second chances, and unexpected bonds, make sure to subscribe. Each story reveals how ordinary people face extraordinary challenges and how love often appears in the least expected places. For Richard, that truth was about to arrive in a form he hadn't anticipated. He thought the solution would come from another professional nanny, someone polished and trained. Instead, it would come from someone entirely different, someone whose strength came not from certificates or textbooks, but from a lifetime of resilience and a heart that saw what others ignored. Richard didn't know it yet, but change was on the horizon. And it would begin the moment Grace Johnson walked into his life. The elevator doors opened to the familiar sight of a new face standing nervously in Richard Wallace's penthouse foyer. Each time the introductions blurred together. Polite smiles, firm handshakes, promises of professionalism. This one was named Miss Carter, a young woman with a master's degree in child development and glowing recommendations from a wealthy family on the Upper East Side. She was nanny number 18, though she didn't know it yet. Richard adjusted his tie, studying her the way he might analyze a potential business partner. "Ethan needs structure," he said, in a clipped voice. "He responds poorly to chaos. Meals at 8, 12, and 6, bed by 9, no exceptions. "Yes, Mr. Wallace," she replied with rehearsed confidence, but her eyes flickered with the same unease Richard had seen in the others. Ethan appeared from the hallway, clutching a small toy car in one hand. His gaze never rose to meet hers. He stood still for a moment, then walked away without a word. Miss Carter followed, attempting cheerful small talk. Hours later, Richard returned from a meeting to find the nanny pale and shaken. "He locked himself in the bathroom for 40 minutes, she explained, her voice trembling. "He screamed when I tried to help. He wouldn't eat, he just sat there staring at the floor. I don't think I'm the right fit." Richard's jaw tightened. "There's been less than a day. I'm sorry, Mr. Wallace, he needs something I can't give." The words echoed in the hallway after she left, her resignation letter already signed in her mind. The cycle repeated itself like a cruel ritual. They arrived full of determination and walked away defeated, often within days. Some blamed Ethan, calling him unmanageable. Others blamed the house, its coldness, its weight. But Richard blamed himself, though he would never admit it aloud. Each nanny brought with them a new wave of disappointment for Ethan. The boy never cried when they left. He never cried at all. But his silence deepened. He would sit at the breakfast table, spoon untouched, eyes fixed on the untouched bowl of cereal in front of him. Richard tried to convince himself it wasn't his fault. He paid them well, more than market rate. He provided resources most families could only dream of. Still, no one stayed. The turnover began to draw whispers among agencies. "The Wallace boy," they muttered. "The impossible case." One night, after the latest nanny had walked out, Richard poured himself a glass of scotch and sat alone in the living room. The city glowed outside, neon lights reflecting off glass towers, but the penthouse felt cavernous and empty. The silence gnawed at him. He glanced at Ethan, curled up on the couch with his toy car. The boy didn't look up, didn't ask a question, didn't acknowledge his father's presence. Richard wanted to break the silence, to reach across the invisible barrier between them. Instead, he muttered to himself, "What am I doing wrong?" The question hung in the air with no answer. Ethan rolled the toy back and forth, the soft clicking of wheels on the coffee table the only sound in the room. The agencies grew reluctant to send replacements. "He needs more than professional care," one representative told Richard bluntly over the phone. "Perhaps a specialist, or even a residential program." Richard bristled. "My son is not a problem to be shipped away. He belongs here." But the words carried little conviction. Deep inside, he feared the agencies were right. Perhaps Ethan needed more than what Richard could provide. Perhaps money couldn't solve this, and that thought terrified him more than any failed deal or hostile takeover ever could. Still, resignation wasn't in his nature. Richard was a man who built empires, who refused to accept defeat. There had to be an answer, even if it hadn't yet revealed itself. He poured another drink, his mind racing, unaware that the real solution would not arrive in the form of another polished professional. The cycle had to end, but not in the way Richard expected. The Wallace penthouse stretched across the upper floors of a glass tower in Manhattan, a monument to wealth and precision. The marble floors gleamed, polished daily. Expensive art lined the walls, paintings chosen by decorators rather than personal taste. The place had the appearance of perfection, but it lacked the warmth of a home. Every surface was immaculate, every object in its place, and yet the air felt heavy, as if the silence itself carried weight. Ethan's world unfolded inside these pristine walls. His mornings began in the kitchen, where a chef prepared organic meals tailored to nutritionist recommendations. Pancakes shaped like animals, smoothies with hidden vegetables, bowls of fruit arranged like rainbows, meals designed to entice a child. Ethan ignored most of them. He sat quietly, legs dangling from the tall chair, pushing food around the plate with a spoon. He rarely looked at the adults who bustled around him. Richard often watched from the other side of the counter, sipping coffee and scanning his phone. He tried to start conversations, always awkward and brief. "Eat your eggs, Ethan," he would say, his voice firm but uncertain. The boy's eyes stayed down. No answer. Moments like these ended with Richard sighing heavily, leaving for work in frustration. He told himself it was normal, that children outgrew phases of silence. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a phase. It was distance, a wall that grew taller every day. The rest of Ethan's days were filled with structure. Tutors arrived promptly at 9, teaching letters and numbers, sometimes music lessons on the piano that sat untouched in the living room. Therapists visited, armed with toys and techniques, trying to coax him into interaction. Some days, Ethan would sit quietly, staring at the floor, refusing to engage. Other days he withdrew even further, hiding under tables or slipping into his room without a word. For Richard, the penthouse became a battlefield between intention and reality. He believed he had done everything right. He had hired the best, spared no expense, created an environment where nothing material was missing. Yet every time he returned from a long day at the office, he found the same scene. His son sitting alone, surrounded by expensive toys scattered like ornaments, none of them played with. It was the silence that unnerved him most. In a city filled with endless noise, honking taxis, blaring sirens, people shouting on crowded streets, his own home was the quietest place of all. The sound of Ethan's toy car rolling back and forth across the coffee table became the dominant rhythm of the household. That faint clicking of plastic wheels echoed through the open spaces, amplifying the loneliness of the rooms. Richard carried the silence like a shadow. At night he lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds from Ethan's room. A laugh, a cry, even a call for water. Any sound would have been a sign of connection. But nothing came. The boy slept silently, and Richard wrestled with insomnia, tormented by the absence of a word he longed to hear. Daddy. One evening, returning from a late meeting, Richard stood by Ethan's bedroom door. He saw the boy asleep, curled tightly under the blankets, his small frame almost lost in the oversized bed. A stuffed bear sat untouched beside him. Richard whispered into the quiet room, his voice breaking. "Do you know how much I need you to see me? Do you know how much I need you to call me your father?" The only response was the soft hum of the city outside, distant and indifferent. In the silence of that apartment, wealth had brought comfort but not connection. It had built walls instead of bridges, and each passing day made Richard wonder if his son's voice, the one word he craved most, would ever reach him. The quiet was unbearable, and yet it was the constant rhythm of their lives. Something had to break, though Richard couldn't yet imagine how or when. The call came from the agency late on a grey Tuesday morning. Richard was seated in his office scanning a report when his assistant transferred the line. "Mr. Wallace, we've had difficulty finding another nanny willing to step into your case, but we have someone available immediately. She isn't exactly what you've requested, but she comes with years of domestic experience." Richard frowned. "Not what I requested. She's not a certified nanny. She has a background in housekeeping and childcare, mostly in private homes, but the families she's worked for speak very highly of her." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "Send her. At this point I need someone, anyone." That afternoon, Grace Johnson arrived. She stood in the doorway with a calm presence, a woman of 40 with warm brown skin, steady eyes, and a posture that suggested both strength and patience. Her hands were calloused from years of labor, yet her smile was soft. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing fashionable or polished like the nannies before her, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Mr. Wallace," she greeted, her voice low and even, touched by the cadence of her Georgia upbringing. "Thank you for letting me come." Richard looked her over, skeptical. She was not the image he had envisioned. "The agency said you don't have formal credentials as a nanny." Grace nodded. "That's right, I've raised 3 of my own, all grown now, and I've spent more than 20 years caring for other people's children, from toddlers to teenagers. I don't have certificates to hang on a wall, but I know what children need." Her honesty disarmed him, though he kept his expression cool. "My son is difficult. 18 nannies have already quit. You should know what you're walking into." "I understand," she replied gently. "Children act out for reasons, even when those reasons are hard to see. I don't scare easy, Mr. Wallace." Before Richard could respond, Ethan appeared at the edge of the hallway, half hidden, clutching his ever-present toy car. His eyes flicked toward Grace for only a second, before darting back to the floor. Grace didn't rush forward, or force cheerfulness as so many others had. She simply lowered herself to his level, sitting on the edge of the rug, her hands folded in her lap. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm Grace. You don't have to say anything if you don't feel like it. I'll be around." Ethan blinked, hesitated, then disappeared back into his room. Richard exhaled sharply. "You see? That's how it always goes." They shut down around him. Grace rose slowly, meeting Richard's gaze with quiet firmness. "He didn't shut down. He tested me. Children don't open doors to strangers right away, and they shouldn't. Trust takes time." Her words unsettled him. No nanny had ever spoken to him with such certainty, and certainly not with that steady calm. Most had apologized for Ethan's behavior, promised to fix him. Grace didn't see him as broken. Richard crossed his arms, trying to maintain authority. Time is not something I can waste. My schedule is demanding. I expect results. Grace didn't flinch. Then we'll need to agree on one thing, Mr. Wallace. I can't promise results. I can only promise to be here for your boy, to give him patience and care. The rest will follow if it's meant to. The firmness in her tone caught him off guard. For a moment he had no reply. He had built his life on guarantees, contracts, and measurable outcomes. Grace offered none of that, only presence. Something about her unsettled him, but also sparked a flicker of curiosity. Could this woman succeed where so many had failed? As the evening shadows lengthened across the penthouse windows, Richard realized the rhythm of the house had shifted. Grace had only just arrived, yet the silence seemed less suffocating. Grace began her mornings in the Wallace household, not with instructions barked through a strict routine, but with quiet observation. She noticed what others had overlooked. Ethan never touched the colorful plates the chef arranged, but showed faint curiosity when the smell of butter and cinnamon drifted from the stove. So, one morning, Grace tied on an apron and made simple French toast, golden and warm, cut into small squares. She placed the plate in front of Ethan without a word. The boy stared, suspicious at first. His little hands hovered over the fork, then hesitantly picked up a piece. He chewed slowly. For the first time in weeks, he finished half a plate. Grace didn't cheer or press. She only smiled gently and said, "I'm glad you liked it." Richard, reading the newspaper across the counter, glanced up. He usually refuses breakfast. Grace shrugged. Sometimes a child doesn't need fancy. Sometimes he just needs familiar. Her tone was calm, almost casual, but Richard heard an undercurrent of challenge. He frowned, folding the paper. He needs nutrition, not sugar. Grace's eyes twinkled with quiet defiance. A little sweetness never hurt anyone, Mr. Wallace, especially a child who's forgotten how to enjoy it. Later that day, instead of forcing structured lessons, Grace sat on the floor of the living room with a picture book. She didn't invite Ethan directly. She just opened the book and began reading aloud to herself in a warm, lilting tone. At first, Ethan lingered in the hallway, clutching his toy car as always. But the sound of her voice drew him in. He edged closer, step by step, until he was near enough to see the pictures. He didn't sit beside her, but he listened. Richard watched from the corner, arms crossed, skeptical. "He won't respond," he muttered. Grace didn't look up. "That's all right. Listening is a start." That evening, she knocked softly on Ethan's door before bedtime. "Sweetheart, I'll read one more story before you sleep, if you'd like." She left the book on his nightstand, kissed the top of his blanket without forcing words, and quietly stepped out. When Richard checked in later, he found Ethan asleep, the book open beside him. Something in that simple sight unsettled him. None of the others had managed even that much. The following days revealed more cracks in the wall Ethan had built around himself. Grace hummed softly while folding laundry, and Ethan began to linger nearby, listening. She brought small paper bags of grapes, cutting them into halves the way mothers often did, and Ethan reached for them without hesitation. Once she knelt beside him and said, "Would you like me to push your car across the table with you?" To Richard's astonishment, Ethan gave the faintest nod. It was nothing grand, no sudden transformation, but each tiny shift carried weight. For Richard, however, the changes stirred conflict rather than relief. One evening he cornered Grace in the kitchen. "I don't like how you're ignoring structure. Bedtime routines, scheduled play, discipline, it all matters." Grace calmly placed a pan on the counter. "Structure matters, yes, but connection matters more. Your boy doesn't need a manager, Mr. Wallace. He needs someone who sees him." Her words stung. Richard straightened his tie, clinging to formality. "I've given him everything. This house, the best care, and yet he is lonely." Grace interrupted softly, her voice steady. "What he needs isn't more money spent. It's someone willing to wait with him in the silence until he's ready to speak." Richard's chest tightened. He hated how her words pierced truths he avoided. That night, as he passed Ethan's room, he paused at the door. The boy was asleep again, toy car tucked under his arm, but there was something new, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his face. Richard stood frozen, torn between skepticism and hope. For the first time in months, the silence inside the penthouse didn't feel like suffocation. It felt like the beginning of something fragile, something that might finally change. The tension built slowly, like a storm gathering over the horizon. Richard prided himself on control, yet every interaction with Grace chipped away at it. She moved through his house with calm authority, making choices without consulting him. He had hired her as a maid, and yet she behaved as though she had a right to challenge him. What unsettled him most wasn't her defiance. It was the small but undeniable progress she was making with Ethan. One morning, Richard entered the kitchen to find Ethan perched on a stool, eating oatmeal sprinkled with cinnamon. Grace stood at the stove, humming an old gospel tune under her breath. Ethan glanced up, spoon halfway to his mouth, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met his father's. Richard froze, stunned by the directness of that look. But before he could speak, Ethan dropped his gaze again, shoving another spoonful into his mouth. Grace noticed. "He's starting to come out," she said quietly, with a smile that carried both pride and patience. Richard cleared his throat. "You should have told me you were changing his meals. The chef prepares specific menus." Grace didn't flinch. "Sometimes a boy needs less menu and more comfort. Cinnamon reminds him of warmth. That's why he eats it." Her certainty made Richard bristle. "I don't pay you to experiment with my son." Grace turned from the stove, her voice steady but firm. "No, Mr. Wallace, you pay me to care for him." "That's exactly what I'm doing." The words stung because they rang true. Still, Richard's pride rose like a wall. Discipline is what matters. He needs to learn routine, not indulgence. "You're letting him dictate the rules." Grace met his gaze, unyielding. "Discipline without connection is just control, and control is not love. Ethan doesn't need another person barking orders. He needs someone willing to hear him, even when he says nothing." For a moment, the kitchen filled with silence thicker than before. Richard felt exposed, as if she had read pages of his life he'd kept sealed. The clash didn't end there. Later that week, Richard returned from a business meeting to find Grace and Ethan sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, crayons scattered between them. Ethan was quietly coloring a car, his concentration deep. Richard's first instinct was irritation. "Crayons? On the rug? That rug cost more than most people make in a year," he snapped. Grace didn't rise. She calmly placed another sheet of paper in front of Ethan. "Rugs can be cleaned. A moment of trust can't be replaced." Ethan paused, his small hand gripping a crayon tighter. His shoulders tensed at Richard's harsh tone. Richard noticed and felt the sting of guilt. But pride pushed him to defend himself. "He needs structure, not scribbles." Grace's reply was soft but cutting. "He needs a father, not a manager." The words echoed in the room, sharper than any boardroom insult Richard had ever endured. He opened his mouth to argue, then shut it again, realizing he had nothing to counter. Grace had spoken the truth he had avoided for years. That night, Richard paced his office, staring out at the endless city lights. The clash between them gnawed at him. She was just a maid, he told himself. She shouldn't have this kind of influence. Yet in his son's faint smile, in the subtle shifts of his behavior, Richard saw undeniable evidence. She was reaching Ethan in ways he had never managed. The realization both infuriated and intrigued him. Grace wasn't bending to his world of rules and expectations. Instead, she was quietly remaking it, and whether he admitted it or not, part of him wondered if she might be right. The weekend sun bathed Central Park in shades of gold, filtering through the trees as children's laughter carried across the wide fields. Grace insisted that Ethan needed fresh air, not just structured lessons or toys boxed inside glass walls. Richard had resisted at first, muttering about germs, about crowds, about wasted time. But in the end, Grace had won. Now standing awkwardly by a park bench in a tailored suit, Richard watched as Grace held Ethan's hand, guiding him toward the grass. The boy hesitated at the edge, his toy car clutched tightly. His eyes scanned the playground where other children ran, their voices loud, their movements free. He lingered, his small shoulders drawn tight. Grace crouched beside him. "You don't have to join them right away, sweetheart. Just watch for a while, there's no hurry." Richard shifted impatiently. "If he just stands there, what's the point?" Grace turned her head slowly, her gaze steady. "The point is, he's here. Outside. That's already more than yesterday." Richard bit back a reply, his jaw clenched. Yet as the minutes passed, he noticed the way Ethan's body softened. His grip on the toy car loosened. His eyes followed the children chasing each other, curiosity flickering where indifference once lived. Then it happened, quietly, almost imperceptibly. A small boy tripped near Ethan, dropping his ball. Without thinking, Ethan bent down, picked it up and handed it back. The boy grinned and shouted, "Thanks," before running off again. For a brief second, Ethan's lips curved upward. A smile, subtle, fleeting, but real. Richard's heart lurched. He blinked, almost doubting what he saw. Did he just— "Yes," Grace whispered, her own smile wide and genuine. He smiled. The world seemed to tilt for Richard. It wasn't the roar of success he knew from boardrooms, not the triumph of closing $1 million deal. It was smaller, quieter, infinitely more powerful. His son had smiled. Grace encouraged Ethan to take slow steps onto the grass. The boy walked a few paces, then a few more, until his small feet carried him closer to the sound of laughter. Richard followed behind, every instinct urging him to control, to guide, to intervene. But Grace lifted her hand slightly, signaling him to wait. "Let him find his own way," she murmured. Richard hesitated, then forced himself to stay back. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar mix of fear and hope. He felt powerless, yet in that powerlessness, something shifted. Ethan stopped near a group of children tossing a frisbee. For a long moment he stood still, silent as always. Then, to Richard's astonishment, he let his toy car drop into the grass and reached out to catch the frisbee as it sailed clumsily toward him. His small hands barely managed to grip it, but when he did, laughter spilled from his mouth. Clear, bright, and utterly unexpected. The sound pierced Richard like lightning. He froze, unable to breathe, afraid that if he moved, the moment would vanish. Grace's eyes glistened. She didn't speak, didn't break the fragile magic. Richard swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "I've never heard him laugh like that. It's been inside him all along," Grace replied softly. "He just needed space to let it out." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Ethan played cautiously, then with more freedom, his laughter mingling with the other children's. Richard stood at the edge, hands trembling slightly in his pockets, unable to reconcile the boy before him with the silent child he had known for years. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange, Ethan returned, sweaty and flushed, his toy car forgotten for the first time. He looked at Grace and allowed her to wipe his face with a napkin, then turned toward his father, just for a moment. Their eyes met, and though Ethan said nothing, Richard felt it like a spark of recognition. It was the first breakthrough, small yet monumental, and Richard knew deep inside that nothing in his life would ever feel more important. The days following their visit to Central Park carried a different rhythm inside the Wallace penthouse. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt suffocating. Richard noticed small changes, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Ethan hummed softly to himself while lining up his toy cars. He peeked into the kitchen when Grace cooked, standing in the doorway longer than before. And once Richard caught him pressing a crayon gently against paper, without being prompted. Grace used those moments like seeds, planting them carefully. One morning she placed 2 bowls of cereal on the kitchen table, instead of 1. "Breakfast is better when someone eats with you," she said, motioning to Richard. Reluctantly, he sat beside his son. Ethan didn't look at him, but he didn't leave either. Richard ate silently, every spoonful awkward, but Grace only smiled knowingly. Later, she invited Richard into Ethan's nightly routine. "He doesn't need perfection, Mr. Wallace. He just needs you present." Richard stiffened. "I'm not good at this. He barely looks at me." "Then let him look at your effort," she replied gently. That evening, Richard sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, book in hand. His voice was uneven as he began reading, stumbling over the animated tones that Grace seemed to manage effortlessly. Ethan lay still, silent, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Richard's throat tightened with embarrassment. Midway through, he closed the book. "I don't know how to do this right," he confessed quietly. From the stillness, a small hand reached out, brushing the edge of his sleeve. Richard froze, breath caught in his chest. Ethan didn't speak, but the gesture carried weight heavier than words. Richard placed his hand gently over his son's, holding it there until Ethan drifted into sleep. The next day, Grace urged Richard into more ordinary roles. "Help him pour the juice," she suggested. "Play catch for 10 minutes. Sit with him while he draws." Richard resisted at first. "That's your job." Grace met his eyes firmly. "No, that's a father's job." So Richard tried. He clumsily poured orange juice, spilling drops on the counter. Ethan giggled. A sound faint, almost hidden, but real. Richard blinked in shock, then laughed nervously himself. They played ball in the living room, Richard fumbling with exaggerated misses that drew another tiny laugh. Each moment was fragile, like glass threatening to shatter, but it was progress. Still, doubt lingered. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Richard sat with Grace in the quiet kitchen. His shoulders slumped, his usual armor stripped away. "What if it isn't enough?" he asked, his voice low. "What if he never lets me in?" Grace poured 2 cups of tea, sliding one across the table. "Children are like locked doors. You don't break them down. You wait, you knock, you show them you'll still be there tomorrow. He's starting to believe you might stay." Richard stared into the steam rising from his cup, emotions swirling. For so long he had equated success with speed, with control. Now, for the first time, he was being asked to surrender both. The following weekend, Richard found himself kneeling on the rug, rolling Ethan's toy car back and forth. At first, Ethan's responses were mechanical, just small pushes in return, but as minutes passed, his eyes lifted briefly toward his father. For an instant they met, dark brown eyes mirroring Richard's own. The boy's gaze flickered with something new, not fear, not resistance, but a spark of recognition. It lasted only a heartbeat before Ethan looked away, clutching the car. Yet for Richard, it was enough to keep trying. The walls were still standing, but now there were cracks, visible, widening, impossible to ignore. And Richard realized he had begun to crave those cracks more than any deal, more than any triumph his fortune could bring. Richard's transformation with Ethan was fragile, and every step forward left him more unsettled than relieved. The progress forced him to look inward, to confront truths he had long buried. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Richard poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat alone in his study. The city's hum floated faintly through the window, but inside the silence was heavy, demanding. His mind drifted backward, unbidden, to his own childhood in Connecticut. His father, Charles Wallace, had been a towering figure, disciplined, commanding, impossible to please. Their house had been grand but cold, the kind of home where footsteps echoed against polished wood and voices were kept low. Love was measured in achievements, report cards, trophies, internships secured before college. Richard could still hear his father's voice, sharp and unforgiving. "Stop crying. Crying won't make you strong. Wallace men don't show weakness." He remembered standing on the baseball field at age 10, bat in hand, stomach tight with nerves. When he struck out, tears had welled in his eyes. His father's expression from the stands had been one of disappointment, not comfort. Afterward, in the car, silence stretched until his father muttered, "If you want to matter in this world, you can't afford to be soft." Those words had followed Richard into adulthood. They drove him through late nights at the office, fueled his hunger for success, and built the empire he now controlled. But they also hollowed him out, leaving him ill-equipped for tenderness. Now facing his own son's silence, he realized how easily cycles repeated. Grace noticed his distance in the days that followed. One night, while washing dishes, she asked quietly, "What's weighing on you, Mr. Wallace?" Richard hesitated, unused to sharing. "My father," he admitted finally. "He was everything I thought a man was supposed to be. Strong, controlled, successful, but never gentle." He paused, swallowing hard. "I think I became him, and that's why Ethan won't let me in. I don't know how to be anything else." Grace dried her hands on a towel, her eyes steady. "You don't have to be your father. You get to choose what kind of man, what kind of father you'll be." Richard shook his head. "It's not that simple. Habits, patterns, they run deep." Grace stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Patterns only run as deep as the courage we give them. Break them, even in small ways. Show Ethan you're more than what you were taught." Her words unsettled him, stirring both resistance and hope. He wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. Could he, a man who had spent decades defining himself through control, learn to live through vulnerability? Later that night, Richard stood by Ethan's bed again, watching the boy sleep. He reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his son's forehead. The gesture felt foreign, almost clumsy, but it carried a tenderness he had never shown before. His chest tightened as he whispered, "I don't want to be him, Ethan. I don't want to fail you the way he failed me." The boy stirred, turning onto his side, unaware of his father's confession. Richard withdrew, but something had shifted inside him. He saw the truth with painful clarity. Ethan's silence wasn't only his son's wound, It was also his mirror, reflecting years of unspoken pain passed down from one Wallace generation to the next. As Richard closed the door gently, he knew he could no longer ignore the shadows of his past. They had to be confronted or they would continue to shape the future. The realization lingered like a weight in his chest. Breaking free would not be easy, but for the first time he wanted to try, not for himself, but for the boy who had never called him Daddy. The Monday after his conversation with Grace, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He cleared his calendar. His secretary was stunned. But Mr. Wallace, the investor meeting. Reschedule it, Richard interrupted. I'm taking the day. He hung up before she could argue, his pulse racing with unease. For decades, his life had been dictated by meetings and deadlines. Now, for one day, he chose his son instead. At breakfast, Ethan sat at the table as usual, pushing cereal around with his spoon. Grace placed 2 packed lunches on the counter and looked at Richard with a subtle nod. You're ready, he exhaled. As I'll ever be. Grace crouched beside Ethan. Sweetheart, your dad's going to spend the day with you. Just the 2 of you. How does that sound? Ethan didn't answer, but his eyes flickered with curiosity. Richard felt a tremor of hope. They started with the zoo. Richard had chosen it on a whim, remembering his own childhood trip long ago. As they entered, the noise of families, children's squeals, and animal calls filled the air. Ethan clutched his toy car tightly, eyes darting nervously. Richard bent down, awkward but earnest. It's all right, buddy, he said softly. We'll go slow. Just you and me. They wandered past the enclosures. Lions basking in the sun, monkeys swinging from ropes, penguins diving through clear water. Ethan walked close but silent, his car still in hand. Richard tried to mimic Grace's patience, resisting the urge to fill the silence with commands. At the giraffe exhibit, Ethan stopped suddenly, his small hand lifted, pointing. The tall animal bent its neck gracefully, munching leaves. For the first time, Ethan's lips parted. Tall, he whispered. Richard froze. His chest swelled, his throat tightened. He crouched beside his son. Yes, he said, voice unsteady. Tall, very tall. It was only one word, but it was more than Richard had heard in weeks. His eyes stung as he watched Ethan gaze at the giraffe with wonder. They ate lunch on a bench, peanut butter sandwiches Grace had packed. Richard spilled grape jelly on his shirt, making Ethan giggle. The sound was small, but it pierced Richard's heart. He laughed too, unguarded, letting go of his polished image. In the afternoon, they rode the carousel. Richard climbed onto a painted horse beside Ethan, gripping the pole awkwardly. As the music played and the ride began, Ethan's face lit with cautious delight. The boy leaned into the movement, a faint laugh escaping as the horse rose and fell. Richard's heart thudded with joy. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about work, deals, or failures. He was simply there, father and son, sharing a moment that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. As the day drew to a close, they walked back toward the car. Ethan's small hand slipped into Richard's without warning. Richard nearly stopped in his tracks, overwhelmed by the simple gesture. He tightened his grip gently, afraid to break the fragile connection. Neither spoke during the ride home, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, of unspoken promises. That evening, Richard sat on Ethan's bed, reading the same book he had stumbled through before. His voice still lacked Grace's rhythm, but he kept going. Ethan didn't pull away. Instead, when the story ended, he shifted closer, his head resting lightly against Richard's arm. Richard blinked rapidly, fighting the flood of emotion. He didn't dare move, afraid the spell would break. For years he had been a provider, a man of control, but in that moment he was simply what Ethan needed, present. It was his first real step into fatherhood, fragile and imperfect, but finally true. The following week began with a new rhythm, one Richard was unaccustomed to. Ethan had grown more open since their day at the zoo, and Grace wasted no time pushing Richard further. She refused to let him slip back into his old role of detached provider. One morning she handed him a small lunchbox. "Your turn," she said firmly. Richard looked down at the box as though it were a contract filled with hidden clauses. "What do you mean, my turn? You're packing Ethan's lunch today, peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, maybe some crackers, nothing fancy." "He doesn't need a chef, he needs you." Richard frowned. "I have a meeting." Grace cut him off with a raised brow. "The meeting can wait. This can't." Reluctantly, Richard obeyed. His movements were clumsy, peanut butter smeared unevenly on the bread, apple slices too thick. But when he placed the lunchbox in front of Ethan, the boy studied it for a moment, then took it without protest. For Richard, that acceptance felt like a silent victory. Later that afternoon, Grace brought out a ball. "Why don't you two play catch?" Richard hesitated. "He doesn't even like sports." Grace smiled knowingly. "He doesn't like being ignored either. Try." Richard crouched down, tossing the ball gently toward his son. Ethan let it roll past him at first, but Grace clapped her hands softly. "Go on, sweetheart, give it back." Slowly, Ethan picked up the ball and rolled it back. Richard caught it, his chest tightening at the simple act. They repeated the motion again and again until Ethan's throws grew stronger. A flicker of joy crossed the boy's face, small but unmistakable. That night, however, the fragile progress faced its first real test. Grace deliberately stepped out of the bedtime routine, handing Richard the book. "It's your turn," she said. Richard's eyes widened. "Alone?" "He won't—" "Try," Grace interrupted, her tone final. Nervously, Richard entered Ethan's room. The boy clutched his toy car, watching warily as his father sat down. Richard's voice trembled as he read, his eyes darting toward Ethan's face for any reaction. Halfway through, Ethan turned away, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. Richard's chest ached. "I know I'm not good at this," he whispered, "but I want to be here. Even if I stumble, even if you push me away, I'm not going anywhere." To his surprise, Ethan didn't cry for Grace. He shifted closer, resting his toy car against Richard's knee. Richard blinked rapidly, fighting back emotion, and kept reading until his son drifted off. When Richard stepped back into the hallway, Grace was waiting, arms crossed. Her eyes softened when she saw the mixture of relief and exhaustion on his face. "He didn't ask for you," Richard admitted quietly, "but he didn't push me away either." Grace nodded. "That's how it starts, step by step." "You showed him you won't run when it's hard." Richard sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. "I feel like I'm failing every second." Grace placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Failure is walking away. Struggle is proof you're trying. Ethan doesn't need perfect, Mr. Wallace. He just needs present." The words cut deep, forcing Richard to see himself not as the untouchable businessman, but as a father learning from scratch. And for the first time, he wasn't ashamed of the struggle, only afraid of losing momentum. He didn't know how long it would take for Ethan to fully trust him, but tonight had shown him a glimpse of possibility. And that glimpse was enough to keep fighting. Richard's progress with Ethan felt like walking across thin ice. Every step forward came with the fear of collapse. For weeks, he pushed himself into daily routines, each interaction fragile but real. Yet beneath the surface, doubt gnawed at him. He still felt unworthy, a man stumbling in roles that others seemed to embrace naturally. Grace saw it, though he tried to hide it behind his usual sternness. One evening, after another long attempt at reading Ethan to sleep, Richard found himself pacing the kitchen, restless. Grace entered quietly, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're burning yourself out," she said softly. Richard's shoulders stiffened. "I'm trying, isn't that what you wanted?" "Yes," Grace answered, her tone firm. "But you're trying like a man desperate to prove something, not like a father who wants to love." The words struck him like a blow. He slammed a hand against the counter. "What do you know about what I want? You think I don't love him? That boy is my entire life. But he won't let me in, and maybe it's because I don't deserve it." Grace didn't flinch. "Love isn't about deserving, Mr. Wallace. It's about showing up, even when you feel unworthy." He turned sharply toward her, his voice rising. 18 nannies, countless therapists, endless money. I've tried everything. Nothing works. Nothing. Maybe I'm just not enough. Maybe I never will be." For the first time, Grace's calm cracked. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "Stop hiding behind your excuses. You think Ethan needs perfection? He doesn't. He needs a father who will fight through rejection, through silence, through failure. You say you've tried everything, but what you haven't done is let go of your pride long enough to simply be there." Her words cut deep. Richard felt raw, stripped bare of the armor he wore in every boardroom and negotiation. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands. His voice broke when he whispered, "I'm afraid, Grace. Afraid he'll never see me as his father. Afraid I'll fail him the way mine failed me." Grace's tone softened, but her conviction remained. "Fear is human, but running from it makes you your father's son all over again. Face it, Let Ethan see you scared, see you imperfect. That's where trust is born. Richard looked up, eyes wet, anger now mixed with desperation. And what if I can't? What if he never calls me Daddy? Grace leaned down, meeting his gaze directly. Then you'll still have been the man who tried. And that matters more than the title you crave. The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of truth. Richard's chest rose and fell as he fought for breath, his mind reeling. He had built his life on winning, on never admitting weakness. But tonight, Grace forced him to see that fatherhood wasn't a competition. It was surrender. For the first time, Richard allowed the possibility that his worth as a father might not come from success, but from persistence. The realization terrified him, but it also cracked something open inside. He didn't respond. He simply sat in silence, broken but listening. Grace stepped back, giving him space. Her eyes lingered on him with both firmness and compassion. When she finally spoke again, her voice was gentle. The breaking point isn't where you fail, Mr. Wallace. It's where you decide who you'll become. Richard nodded faintly, unable to find words, but in his silence, he felt the truth settling in his bones. The storm broke in the middle of the night. Thunder rolled over Manhattan, shaking the glass walls of the penthouse. Lightning flashed, followed by the sharp crack of rain hammering against the windows. Richard woke with a start, heart pounding from a dream he couldn't remember. Then he heard it, a sound that froze him. Ethan's cry. It wasn't a whimper or soft murmur. It was raw, panicked, the kind of cry that cut through every layer of silence that had blanketed the boy for years. Richard sprang from bed, his bare feet cold on the marble floor as he rushed down the hallway. He pushed open Ethan's door and found his son thrashing under the covers, fists clenched, tears streaking his face. His toy car lay on the floor, forgotten. The boy's voice, usually locked away, now poured out in broken sobs. "Mommy! Mommy!" Ethan screamed, his voice hoarse. Richard's chest tightened like a vice. He hadn't heard his son speak her name since infancy. The sound shattered him. He hurried to the bedside, reaching out with trembling hands. "Ethan, it's okay, I'm here." The boy flinched at first, his small body rigid with fear. Richard hesitated, then climbed onto the bed, wrapping his arms around him. Ethan resisted, pounding his tiny fists weakly against his father's chest, but Richard held firm, his voice breaking. "I've got you. You're safe." "I won't let go." Minutes passed, the storm outside echoing the storm within the room. Slowly, Ethan's resistance faltered. His fists loosened, his sobs softening into hiccups. His head buried itself against Richard's chest, damp with tears. Richard rocked him gently, instinctively, as though the motion had been waiting inside him all along. His own tears slid down his cheeks, falling into Ethan's hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered again and again. "I should have been here sooner. I should have known how to love you better." Ethan clung tighter, his small hands gripping his father's shirt, as though afraid he might disappear. Then, through the broken sobs, came a word Richard had longed for more than anything. "Daddy." It was faint, barely audible, but it cut through the storm like lightning. Richard froze, every muscle locking in place. He pulled Ethan back just enough to look into his eyes. "What did you say?" Ethan's lips trembled. "Daddy." His voice cracked, filled with fear and need, but the word was clear. Richard's heart shattered and healed in the same instant. He pulled his son back into his chest, holding him tighter than ever before. His own sobs erupted, unrestrained. "Yes," he whispered fiercely. "I'm your daddy. Always. And I'm not going anywhere." The storm outside raged on, but within that room, something shifted permanently. Years of silence broke apart in the span of one fragile, miraculous moment. Richard didn't know how long they stayed like that. Minutes, hours, an eternity. He only knew he didn't let go. Ethan's breathing steadied against him, his body finally relaxing, trust replacing fear. Richard kissed the top of his head, whispering promises into the darkness. When dawn finally painted the sky with pale light, father and son were still wrapped in each other's arms. For the first time, Richard felt the bond he had dreamed of, not imagined but real, alive, spoken in a single word. He realized then that Grace had been right all along. Connection wasn't earned by control, but by surrender. And in surrendering, he had gained what all the money, all the nannies, all the structure in the world had failed to bring him. He had gained his son's voice, and with it his son's heart. Morning sunlight poured into the penthouse, catching on the edges of the glass walls and filling the rooms with warmth. For the first time in years, the silence inside wasn't heavy. It was calm. Richard awoke with Ethan still nestled against him, the boy's small hand gripping his shirt as if afraid to let go. The memory of that single word, Daddy, echoed in Richard's mind like a hymn, reverberating through every corner of his soul. He brushed his hand gently through Ethan's hair, overwhelmed. So this is what it feels like, he thought. Not the thrill of a deal, not the weight of an empire, but the simple, irreplaceable bond of being needed. Grace entered quietly, a soft smile playing on her lips. She didn't speak, just nodded as if to say she had known this moment would come. Richard's throat tightened. Later that day, Richard found himself changed in ways he couldn't explain. He made breakfast himself, burning the first batch of eggs, but laughing when Ethan giggled at the smoke. He and Ethan sat together on the kitchen stools, eating toast and jam, sticky fingers leaving marks on the marble counters Richard once guarded so obsessively. Grace watched from the side, her eyes shimmering. She said nothing, allowing father and son the space to discover each other. The breakthroughs came in waves. That afternoon, Ethan tugged on Richard's sleeve and whispered, "Play?" The single word struck Richard harder than any boardroom deal ever could. He dropped everything, kneeling on the carpet to build a tower of blocks. Ethan laughed when it toppled, clapping his small hands, and Richard laughed with him until tears blurred his vision. Over the following days, Ethan's voice grew steadier. Short words at first: juice, car, outside, each one like a gift, carefully unwrapped. Richard treasured every syllable. At bedtime, the boy whispered, "Read," and for the first time, the request wasn't for Grace, but for him. Richard's heart swelled as he opened the book and began, his voice no longer clumsy but steady, alive with love. One evening after Ethan had drifted to sleep, Richard found Grace standing by the window, gazing out at the city lights. He approached her, words heavy in his chest. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't just care for Ethan. You saved him, and you saved me too." Grace turned, her expression soft but resolute. "You saved yourself, Mr. Wallace. I only showed you the door. You walked through it." Richard's eyes burned. He had spent years thinking strength meant control, that love had to be earned through perfection. But now he understood. It was presence, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable. The transformation seeped into every corner of his life. At work, colleagues noticed his softened edge, the way he listened more than he barked orders. But at home was where the true change thrived. Richard no longer stood at a distance, watching Ethan from the shadows. He was beside him, building, laughing, comforting, living. One night, as Richard tucked Ethan into bed, the boy clutched his toy car and whispered, "Daddy, stay." Richard's chest swelled with emotion. He lay beside him, holding the boy close. "Always," he whispered back. "I'm not going anywhere." The words were a promise, not just to his son, but to himself. From the doorway, Grace watched quietly, her heart full. She didn't need recognition or praise. The sight was enough. Father and son bound not by wealth or rules, but by love finally spoken and received. The silence that had once suffocated the Wallace home was gone. In its place was laughter, whispers, and the fragile but powerful music of healing. Autumn arrived in New York, brushing the city with crisp air and leaves the color of fire. The Wallace penthouse, once cold and sterile, had changed too. It was no longer defined by silence. Now soft footsteps, bursts of laughter, and the hum of bedtime stories filled its halls. Richard often caught himself marveling at the transformation. Some mornings, Ethan padded into the kitchen, rubbing his sleepy eyes, and whispered, "Daddy, breakfast?" Each time, Richard's heart clenched with gratitude. He had chased wealth his entire life, but nothing compared to that word spoken with trust. Grace remained a steady presence in their lives, though her role had shifted. She wasn't just the maid who kept order in the household. She was a mentor, a guide, and, whether Richard admitted it aloud or not, a friend. She moved through the home with quiet assurance, watching with pride as Ethan blossomed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, painting the city in shades of gold, Richard asked her to sit with him. He poured 2 cups of tea, placing one in front of her. "You changed everything," he said softly. "I thought I was saving Ethan by hiring help, but the truth is you saved me too. You showed me how blind I was, how afraid I'd become of failing as a father." Grace smiled, her eyes warm. "You didn't fail, Mr. Wallace. You learned. That's what fathers do. They grow alongside their children." And Ethan will never forget that you chose to stay when it mattered most. Richard's gaze drifted toward Ethan's room, where his son's faint laughter floated out as he played with toy cars on the rug. For years, I thought money was the answer. I thought structure and perfection would make up for everything I couldn't give, but none of it mattered. What he wanted was me. Just me. Grace nodded. Children know the truth better than adults do. They can't be fooled by wealth or titles. They see who shows up. The simplicity of her words struck him deeper than any speech he had ever heard. He realized then that his greatest title wasn't CEO or millionaire. It was Daddy. That night, Richard tucked Ethan into bed. The boy clutched his toy car as always, but now he reached out his other hand, pulling his father closer. "Stay," Ethan whispered. Richard lay beside him, brushing his hair back gently. "Always," he promised. His son's breathing slowed, steady and safe, and Richard felt peace settle into his bones. For the first time in years, he no longer feared the silence. Because it wasn't silence anymore. It was security, comfort, love, unspoken but deeply felt. Grace passed by the doorway, pausing just long enough to see father and son curled together. She smiled quietly and moved on, content in the knowledge that her work was done, though her presence would remain. As the seasons turned, Richard continued to balance boardrooms with bedtime stories, contracts with coloring books, and while the world still saw him as a titan of business, Richard knew the truth. His greatest victory wasn't written in headlines or measured in wealth. It was found in the small hand that reached for his every morning, the small voice that whispered, "Daddy," with trust and love. This story reminds us that transformation is possible, that love can break cycles, heal wounds, and restore what silence once stole. Before we close, if this journey touched you, make sure to subscribe. Stories like these reveal the extraordinary power hidden in ordinary lives, the power of connection, resilience, and hope. And if you want to keep walking through stories that move the heart, don't stop here. Click the video suggested on your screen. Another powerful tale is waiting for you there.